today I just wanted to take a quick look at the 1922 film Nosferatu. Before we do get into that though, because I guess you could say there has been ongoing debate whether or not Nosferatu actually was the first adaptation of Dracula. There is talk that there was a film from 1920, a Russian film also titled Dracula, which supposedly was the first true adaptation. The only thing is, supposedly all surviving copies of this film are no longer in existence, so there is no way of proving whether or not this film actually existed. Strangely enough, there was at one point in time a video that was found on YouTube claiming to be the original missing film. Of course, upon closer study, it was determined that that was a lie. But, yeah, I couldn't help it. But, so obviously, first surviving copy of Dracula would be the 1922 Nosferatu. And, of course, we're all familiar with the backstory. Of course, the film was ordered destroyed by Bram Stoker's widow. Obviously, she was living off of the estate, and the film was just determined to be, obviously because the rights were not purchased or were not given, so they did cross the copyright infringement issue, even though certain characters' names were changed, certain characters were omitted, but it was still too close to the original, so a judge did side with Stoker's widow, and the film was ordered destroyed. Of course, by this point in time, the film was already circulating through cinema, and obviously copies of the film had already been made to be forwarded to other theaters. So, of course, due to this process, there were a few surviving copies of the film which did not appear until later, but of course, Stoker's widow was allowed to die a happy woman because she assumed she got her way, which, ironically, a film that was just so shunned, I guess you could say, by his widow, was actually considered to have been a major influence in cinema. And of course, if it weren't due to the fact that the film was in hiding for so much time, it perhaps also would have been considered an even bigger influence on vampire film in general. Obviously, the film did have somewhat of a major impact within the areas that it circulated, and it did influence film within those areas, but considering the fact that Nosferatu was just in the dark for so long, and perhaps a lot of people, their first exposure to Dracula was the 1930s version, of course the well-groomed tuxedo-wearing gentleman, of course that went on to once again influence numerous film, but of course the original image of the vampire is just very gritty. He's, I guess you could say, filthy. He's not classy at all. He's very much an outsider, as the character himself in the film and the book is depicted. He is a foreigner in a foreign land, and in this situation, physically, Count Orlok, whose name was changed from Dracula, obviously, is very much an outsider. He stands out, and he's extremely obvious as an outsider. So, of course, you can compare this to just modern day as well. You know, whenever there's a tourist or a foreigner that is visiting, they generally tend to stand out because they dress differently, maybe their physical features are different, or it may be in some situations it's not obvious until they speak, but that is, I guess you could say, just very much an allusion to how foreigners are treated in other lands. So there's definitely a lot more going on in this adaptation as far as how the film was thought out. He's not necessarily some bloodthirsty ghoul chasing after a lovely lady. You know, there's definitely a lot more depth here than meets the eye. So obviously the film that released this version of Dracula, Nosferatu, the Prana Film company quickly went bankrupt, and this was the only film that they ever released, which is very unfortunate because if they had the foresight to just give you a completely different look from the way the majority of us, view Dracula, one can only imagine or speculate what other type of influential film they may have put out had Stoker's wife not intervened. So for myself personally, I actually prefer the silent film as opposed to the remake, which we will discuss in just a few moments. But I actually prefer the silent film. I don't know if it's just due to the fact that you have to read and actually pay attention in order to remain, I guess you could say, engaged with the story, but it definitely holds my attention a lot more. I definitely love the use of music, and of course there have been numerous releases of Nosferatu. I believe the first version I ever watched was the version of Nosferatu that had been scored to industrial music, which is very awesome in itself. It definitely gives it a lot different depth and meaning, but of course I did go with a more classic version this time, just kind of trying to see something that's more true to the original release, and it still does hold the interest very much. Of course, it's a silent film, so of course to some degree the actors really do have to overact in order to convey an emotion or get a point across, although you do still have the little cards just telling you what was said and what is actually going on. So, but I don't know, for some reason this is the one that I really prefer. But that is just a quick overview on the original, and I will move into the following film. So next I would like to move into the 1979 film Nosferatu the Vampire. This is actually the first Nosferatu film that I had ever watched, and of course I fight the impulse to refer to him as Nasty Rat Tooth, because he really does have these long rat-shaped teeth. So I'm assuming this was by design, maybe not necessarily to depict how despicable a character he was, because I really don't think him despicable, especially in this version where they try to give him more depth and they imply that he is lonely, obviously in the one scene in which he is noticing a photo of Jonathan's wife. He comments, "What a lovely throat." Of course, it's a very vampire thing to say, but nonetheless, he finds her attractive. So something that I just really brushed over when I was discussing the first film that I'd like to bring back up really quick is, of course, Mina and Jonathan Harker, for the original, or the first release, the silent film, their names had been changed to Ellen and Thomas Hutter. Of course, they were the same characters, but with this 1979 version of the film, their names are reverted back to Mina and Jonathan. Excuse me. And of course, Orlok reverts back to Dracula. So they regain their names. We also have Van Helsing, who is reintroduced back into the story, although he's more of a figurehead. He really doesn't serve much purpose here other than to warn Mina, but it's actually Mina who is the hero in this story. So I guess you could say, to a degree, she's the actual first horror film heroine, not necessarily the last girl as everyone refers to them now, but definitely much in the spirit of what female horror characters are evolving into these days, where they're a lot more powerful, they're a lot more stand-up, or I guess more bluntly stated, she was Ellen Ripley before Ripley even existed. You know, she wasn't, some tough kick-ass woman, but she got the job done. So for the 1979 version of the film, the premise is basically the same. Nothing has really changed here. The story is pretty much the same, but what I really love here is the combination of the nightmare and the fairy tale-like imagery that is used in this film, especially towards the ending. I know I'm skipping all over the place. I'm working with the assumption that the majority of you guys are familiar with this film, so I apologize if you have not seen either version of the film. So let me just slow down really quick and give you the overview. Sorry. So, of course, Jonathan in this version is, of course, once again selling Dracula a home, and Dracula is to be the neighbor of Lucy and Jonathan. So they make the sale on the house as Dracula is making his way over to the New World, which is very important here. He feeds off of the rats on the ship. Of course, once he has run out of rats, he moves on to the crew members, which are very systematically killed because he wants the rats to take the blame so that everyone will assume that they were all victims of the plague. So this is very important here because this leads right into the fairy tale or the dreamlike imagery that I was referencing. So we have very plague-like images. We have loose farm animals that are wandering around in the streets. We have rats that are basically just congregating here and there. And it's definitely one of my favorite scenes in the entire film. I think it's just absolutely beautiful, is you have tables of people who are basically having their last supper. They're basically saying their goodbyes and they're making their peace, but it's just like I said, it's very fairy tale like, it's very nightmarish, but it's very beautiful the way it was handled. The fact that I guess they're accepting their fate and they're making peace with it. So they're essentially welcoming the transition. So it's not like it's something that's being fought or feared. So it gives more the impression that death is something that is to be embraced rather than frowned upon, which I think is a lovely message here, especially when so many people look down on death and that it's something to be feared. They're actually saying the opposite here, that it's something to be welcomed, that it's a natural part of life. So as stated previously, Van Helsing does act as more of a figurehead in this film. He makes his way to Mina. He lets her know that there is a way to defeat the vampire. It's basically a woman of pure heart that has to keep him distracted until day breaks. Of course, once the cock crows, sunlight rises, and the vampire will be vanquished. So it's, I guess you could say, for love of her husband, trying to release Jonathan from this death grip that Dracula has over him, that she sacrifices herself. Obviously, when Jonathan has returned, he's made his way back to Mina, he has very much changed. He's no longer the same person that he was, basically very much under Dracula's spell. He doesn't even remember her, which for her, obviously being his wife, would be the most upsetting thing here, which is very understandable. But she takes it upon herself to make this sacrifice, and she does keep Dracula occupied. Obviously, one of the scenes that everyone loves talking about in this film, which really makes me roll my eyes considering the time period. We're talking about a movie from 1970. Everyone loves talking about the boob grab like it's something so taboo. And my assumption is that the reason people make such a big deal about it is perhaps they're assuming that this scene takes place in the 1922 version rather than 1979. So why I describe this as a minor irritation is 1970s, you had a lot of exploitation film, you had films that very much bordered on I guess you could say soft porn to a degree. So a boob grab is nothing in comparison to the other types of film that were going on during this period. Granted, it's an art house film, it's very classy, it's very tastefully presented, and they have a lot to say here. There definitely is a deeper meaning, once again, behind the story, as I implied in the original film. So, you know, they really do have something to say here. It's not necessarily that they're goofing around, but okay, so addressing the boob grab, obviously the way vampires are viewed now is that they are very sexual creatures, they're very seductive, and of course you could say essentially the vampire's bite is an alternate form of penetration. Not to be vulgar here, but it is what it is, and that's what a lot of people accept this as a metaphor. So the fact that Dracula would touch Mina in such a manner, to me, really doesn't seem out of place, because essentially they are in an intimate moment. She even caresses the back of his head and holds him to her so that he will not leave. So yes, definitely it is essentially a very sexual or romantic type of scene. Obviously, both films are very influential in very different ways. I watch this film every so often. For some odd reason, as I've stated, I prefer the silent film, and obviously it's something that forces you to pay attention and follow along with more, because you have to read title cards and whatnot. But definitely, in my opinion, both very important films. You don't necessarily have to watch the original in order to enjoy the remake. They are very much standalone, and for the most part, they do follow fairly closely. It's just the fairy tale or the dreamlike imagery in this one which really holds my interest, which I find extremely beautiful. But there are definitely aspects of both films which I appreciate, so it's kind of unfair to say which one I prefer over, but I honestly do find the remake just a little bit dull. So that's just me, but I will continue to watch and enjoy both films. So very quickly, you cannot talk Nosferatu without mentioning Shadow of a Vampire. The films basically just go hand in hand, especially if you're doing, kind of like a movie marathon. You have to include this one. It's not a remake, it's definitely something very new and of its own. It's basically a fictionalized, behind-the-scenes account of events that occurred behind the scenes of the 1922 film, if that makes any sense. So basically, you have actors playing character versions of the original actors. So of course you have a character version of the director. So in this version, which definitely makes this extremely interesting to me, and if I remember correctly, it was to a degree inspired by a myth which circulated behind Max Schreck, which it was speculated that he was an actual vampire because he played the part of Nosferatu so well. Obviously, he did play in other films, and to my knowledge, he was primarily a stage actor, which is probably why there weren't so many films by him. But they're basically drawing off of this. So we have the character version of the director who sets out to create the most realistic vampire film ever. So he finds a real vampire to play his star. And of course, the vampire is a bit of a diva. He has his requirements. He can't go out in daylight, obviously, as well as other things that he requires, such as sustenance. So obviously this Nosferatu cat takes a liking to Greta Schroeder, the actress who is playing Ellen Hutter, the heroine, because apparently dangerous women are very attractive. So the director, in a ploy to get the vampire to cooperate, basically promises her to him as a reward just for completing the darned film. Just get through this thing and quit giving me trouble, basically, is what the whole ideology here is. So they're trying to get through this film, and obviously there are several instances which perhaps would have given someone pause because his behavior is just very odd. Of course, the director explained to the cast and crew that this Nosferatu fellow will remain in character throughout the entire shoot, and he will only appear at night. So obviously there's this very awesome scene where he's having a conversation with some of the crew members. A bat flies by and he just snatches it right out of the air and begins feeding on it right in front of them. So they are not alarmed or put off by this. They are basically I guess you could say, praising him because of his commitment to remain in character, aside from the fact that he is just doing something just so darned crazy. But I think even to just like the regular, you know, person in this situation, assuming vampires really are real, I think people would have been put off by it and more adopted the attitude of stay the hell away from me, you're a freak. But they basically continue to interact with him as though nothing were going on. I believe there's only one character who suspects, and of course he really doesn't remain around for much longer, so that's not a problem at all. But I really love the casting in this film. We have Willem Dafoe playing Nosferatu, and I can swear his performance is just so convincing, and he looks so similar to Max Schreck, like even in the segments of the film where they insert segments from the original 1922 film and then you flip back to the 2000 version of the film. They're basically seamless because they really do resemble each other so very closely. So of course the fact that Willem Dafoe seems so perfect for this role is because the part was written specifically for him. Obviously, thankfully, he did take the role, and he just did a knockout job at this. So I think it's definitely a perfect companion piece if you were to do like a marathon with the original, the 1979 remake, and then follow up with Shadow of a Vampire. That just, in my opinion, makes for excellent viewing. Of course, at some point in time, there was even talk of a Nosferatu musical. I do not know if they still tour or if that has been retired. Obviously, if it's still a thing, I would definitely love to check that out. That, to me, just seems amazing. Obviously, this one varies very greatly from the actual 1922 version of the film, and I think it's more of a love story. I'm really not too sure how greatly it deviates, so do not hold me to that. But I think in itself, just the fact, just watching it in a different presentation and medium, it could be an interesting and fun watch. I have heard talk that it's really not that great, and you're better off just skipping the whole darned thing. But you know, it's just that curiosity just to, I guess you could say, finish the cycle that holds my interest here. But that is pretty much all I have for you guys today, and I will talk to you later.